But I decided to go to Iraq because of the media coverage, the selling of the war in Iraq. And right now, if you watch the mainstream media in the United States, I'm sorry, the establishment media, because we're now the mainstream. You're led to think that things aren't, well, they're not going that great, but they're going a little bit better now than it has been in the past. And in fact, even just yesterday, there was a story released by Associated Press that titled, "Thousands Return to Safer Iraqi Capital." And this is, of course, being trumpeted by the administration. And this AP story, just to give you an example, quote, in a dramatic turnaround, more than 3,000 Iraqi families driven out of their Baghdad neighborhoods have returned to their homes in the past 3 months as sectarian violence has dropped, the government said. This information was provided to the media by a man named Sattar Narous, the spokesman for the Ministry of Displacement and Migration in Iraq. He was appointed into that position by Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, who was appointed into his position by the US and UK government. Unlike, for example, reports in the New York Times during the build-up to the war, this one actually had a little disclaimer in it. It said, speaking of the claim made by the spokesman for the Ministry of Displacement and Migration, it said, the claim could not be independently verified. But keep those numbers in mind and keep that story idea in mind as I get to some of the information that I'm going to talk to you about regarding the current situation in Iraq, in particular the refugee crisis. But I decided to go to Iraq because of the U.S. mainstream, the U.S. establishment media selling of the war for the Bush administration. And today, now, of course, the cat's been out of the bag for a long time. We all know exactly what this war is about. We know it had nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction or links to 9/11, and certainly not about liberating the people of Iraq. And now there's this interesting phenomena that's been happening where former high-ranking military generals retire, and then their testicles drop, and they become critical of the policies of the Bush administration. So the most recent addition to the newfound testicle club is the former CENTCOM Commander General John Abizaid. The middle of last month, he was speaking at Stanford University, and don't be fooled, he's not being invited in by universities because of his intellect or this type of thing. He's now a member of the Hoover Institute. But speaking there about the Iraq war, he said, quote, "Of course it's about oil. We can't really deny that." More recently, on October 31, he went on in another speech to say that it may well be 50 years before the U.S. leaves the Middle East. And so we have this information now, today, from generals, other people like Alan Greenspan, other people from other positions that are coming out and being critical of the occupation or how it's being managed, etc. And contrast that with the establishment media reportage of the selling of the war. So I want to take us back to September 6, 2002. Then White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card said about the PR campaign for the Iraq war, quote, "From a marketing point of view, you don't introduce new products in August." With few exceptions, the establishment media was mute. There wasn't critique of how or why a White House Chief of Staff in public to reporters would discuss war and a PR campaign in the same sentence. And that was essentially just let go. But launching a PR campaign for war on September 6th was exactly what Andrew Card announced. Because the very, very next day, on September 7, 2002, George Bush and Tony Blair stood together at Camp David and declared that evidence from a report published by the UN International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, showed that Iraq was 6 months away from building nuclear weapons. It was an outrageous declaration because no such IAEA report existed. I knew this at the time. Anyone else in this room that was reading what UN weapons inspectors and people like Scott Ritter and foreign media outlets were reporting was that there absolutely there was no evidence to support these claims. There were no weapons of mass destruction, etc. And if I, as a citizen of the United States, and anyone else availing themselves of the internet and the access provided by it to information outside of the establishment media could know it, then why couldn't establishment media journalists here do their job? I guess at the time I was naive and idealistic enough to think that journalists should be asking the tough questions, that the job of a journalist is to monitor the centers of power. And particularly, if an administration is going to be making claims that may well be leading this country into war, then a job of a journalist would be to force those people, like, please, Mr. President, can I see that report? What other evidence might there be? That's the job of a journalist. So if journalists were really doing their job, we would have expected the very next day, on September 8, after that stunt at Camp David, maybe the front page of major newspapers would have said, Bush and Blair make completely baseless claim with no evidence that Iraq is 6 months away from obtaining a nuclear weapon. The information was there. There was no reason for that not to have happened. But instead, we had the opposite. A phenomena occurred which journalist John Pilger has described as, when he's discussed the selling of the war by the establishment media, he basically described the coverage as propaganda disguised as journalism. And that's exactly what happened on September 8, 2002, on the front page of the New York Times. The lead story, co-authored by none other than Judith Miller and Michael Gordon of WMD notoriety. Michael Gordon still writes for the paper, of course. Judith Miller remains unrepentant for her coverage. They proudly quoted their favorite source, an anonymous Bush administration official, as saying that, quote, Iraq has stepped up its quest for nuclear weapons and has embarked on a worldwide hunt for materials to make an atomic bomb. That was my red line. I was shocked and outraged that this propaganda disguised as journalism was being crammed down the throats of the majority of the people in this country that didn't even know enough to look to other places for the truth. And I was frustrated and taken aback and losing my mind and decided one thing I could do is go to Iraq and start writing about what I saw. I didn't intend to work as a journalist. I was just going to write weblogs. I was going to go for one trip. I had a couple of $1,000s, a computer, a laptop computer, and a digital camera. And I just went until my money ran out, and then I was going to just come back home and hopefully sleep a little bit better at night. And here I am. No quote-unquote formal journalist training, J school, none of that stuff. But my point is that a regular person, very concerned and upset by what I was seeing happening in my country, once I decided to go take action after my red line was crossed to try to make a difference, I'm here to tell you that you can absolutely make a difference.